In October 1941, the Wehrmacht achieved what seemed impossible, encircling nearly 700,000 Soviet soldiers in less than 2 weeks, prompting Hitler to declare, "The war is won." Yet within 8 weeks, this supreme triumph would become the prelude to Germany's first catastrophic defeat, because the very completeness of their victory blinded them to the abyss ahead. October 1941 stands as one of the most revealing moments of the entire Second World War. The battles of Vyazma and Bryansk were not merely tactical victories. They were a methodical, ideologically driven process of mass encirclement, extermination, and deliberate neglect that represented the Wehrmacht at its most terrifyingly efficient, yet brutally inhumane. This is the story of how supreme military victory bred fatal German arrogance, how operational brilliance enabled crimes against humanity, and how the destruction of 3 entire Soviet army groups led directly to Germany's defeat before Moscow. This is the story of the moment when the Wehrmacht revealed its true nature and sealed its own fate. October 1941. In the span of days, the Soviet Union lost more soldiers than most nations fielded in their entire armies. The numbers alone stagger the imagination. Between 675,000 and 700,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in 2 massive encirclements in less than 14 days of operations. To put this in perspective, this matched or exceeded the scale of the catastrophic Kiev encirclement just weeks earlier, where 665,000 Soviet troops had been lost. 3 entire Soviet army groups, the Western Front under General Ivan Konev, the Reserve Front under Marshal Semyon Budyonny, and the Bryansk Front under General Andrei Yeryomenko, were simultaneously destroyed in a coordinated double-pincer movement that showcased German operational art at its absolute peak. The encirclements represented the culmination of Blitzkrieg doctrine. Mobile armored spearheads penetrated deep into Soviet rear areas, cutting communications and supply lines. Combined arms coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power functioned with mechanical precision. The tempo of operations moved faster than Soviet commanders could react. German forces advanced 150 to 250 kilometers in less than 2 weeks, a rate of movement that paralyzed Soviet decision-making and shattered the cohesion of defending armies. The results seemed to validate every assumption of German military superiority. The racial theories that classified Slavs as inferior appeared confirmed by battlefield results. The Red Army seemed incapable of coordinated defense against the Wehrmacht's operational system. Soviet command structure completely fragmented under the German assault. Front commanders lost contact with their armies. Army commanders lost contact with their divisions. Division commanders lost contact with their regiments. The carefully constructed defensive lines west of Moscow, built with over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and 7,600 guns, disintegrated in days. General Konev's Western Front headquarters struggled to maintain any coherent picture of the battlefield. Marshal Budyonny's Reserve Front evaporated as German panzers sliced through its positions. General Yeryomenko's Bryansk Front found itself encircled before it could execute any organized withdrawal. The scale and speed of the catastrophe left Soviet high command in Moscow reeling, desperately trying to scrape together reserves to defend the capital itself. But how did the Wehrmacht achieve this staggering victory with such terrifying speed and precision? Operation Typhoon began with 3 armored spearheads slicing through Soviet defenses like surgical instruments through tissue. On October 2, 1941, 3 German panzer groups launched coordinated attacks along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers. In the north, Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group and Erich Hupner's 4th Panzer Group drove southeast toward Vyazma. In the south, Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group struck north from the Bryansk area. The operational design was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. The northern pincers would meet behind Vyazma, trapping the bulk of the western and reserve fronts. The southern pincer would encircle the Bryansk front separately. Together, they would destroy Soviet armies west of Moscow, before those forces could retreat to defend the capital. The speed of the German advance shocked even veteran Soviet commanders. On October 3rd, just the second day of operations, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group captured the city of Orel, 150 kilometers behind the supposed front line. Soviet defenders were still eating breakfast when German tanks rolled into the city center. The advance maintained a rate of 50 kilometers per day, a pace that exemplified operational shock. Soviet units attempting to establish new defensive lines found German tanks already in their rear areas before the positions could be fortified. Communications broke down as German spearheads cut telephone lines and overran radio stations. Soviet commanders issued orders to units that no longer existed or could not be reached. Devastating air-ground coordination multiplied the effect of the armored assault. Luftflotte 2 flew hundreds of sorties daily, with waves of Stuka dive bombers hitting Soviet positions just ahead of advancing panzers. Medium bombers struck Soviet headquarters, supply depots, and troop concentrations in the rear. The Luftwaffe had 549 serviceable aircraft dedicated to the Moscow axis, and they flew them relentlessly. Soviet troops described a continuous hell of bombing, with no respite and no effective anti-aircraft defense. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. Units under constant air attack lost cohesion and fighting spirit. Soldiers abandoned positions, not because German tanks had arrived, but because the next wave of bombers was approaching. By October 7th, German forces had closed 2 massive pockets. The northern pincer snapped shut around Vyazma, trapping the bulk of 4 Soviet armies. The southern pincer closed around Bryansk, encircling 3 more Soviet armies. The speed of the encirclement gave Soviet forces no time to organize coherent withdrawal or establish escape corridors. Units that might have retreated in good order found themselves surrounded before commanders even realized the danger. The German operational system had functioned exactly as designed. Mobile warfare, combined arms coordination, and operational tempo had paralyzed Soviet response and achieved encirclement on a scale rarely seen in military history. As the pincers closed with mechanical precision, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped in shrinking pockets. But what awaited them inside would prove far worse than the battle itself. For the trapped Soviet soldiers, the encirclement transformed from military defeat into a descent into hell. Inside the pockets, the experience of encirclement meant the complete breakdown of military organization and the onset of desperate survival. Soviet armies that had maintained defensive positions just days earlier now found themselves cut off from supply, reinforcement, and command. The Luftwaffe intensified its assault on the trapped formations. Hundreds of sorties daily rained bombs on concentrations of troops that had nowhere to hide. Soviet survivors described the experience as a continuous hell. Bombers appeared in waves throughout daylight hours. There were no shelters, no bunkers, no effective anti-aircraft guns. Men huddled in shallow trenches or beneath trees, waiting for the next attack they could hear but not stop. Soviet command and control completely fragmented within the pockets. Radio communications had been severed when German spearheads cut through rear areas. Telephone lines were long since destroyed. Commanders had no contact with higher headquarters in Moscow. Army commanders could not reach their division commanders. Division commanders had no idea where their regiments were or what condition they were in. Attempts to organize coordinated breakout efforts collapsed in confusion. Different units attacked in different directions at different times, allowing German forces to defeat each attempt in detail. The chaos was compounded by conflicting orders. Some commanders ordered their men to hold position and wait for relief that would never come. Others ordered immediate breakout attempts without coordination or reconnaissance. Mass psychological collapse followed the physical breakdown of organization. Soldiers who had fought effectively in defensive positions now faced relentless bombardment without food, ammunition, or hope of relief. The realization of encirclement, that there was no escape, no reinforcement, no possibility of victory, broke the will of entire units. Mass surrenders began within days of the pockets closing. Men emerged from forests with hands raised, desperate for food and water. German accounts describe Soviet soldiers approaching German lines in groups of hundreds, sometimes thousands, too exhausted and demoralized to continue resistance. The speed of psychological collapse reflected the completeness of the operational catastrophe. The fate of Soviet senior leadership embodied the disaster. General Mikhail Lukin, commander of the 16th Army, was captured when his headquarters was overrun. Other senior officers were killed attempting to lead breakout efforts. The commanders who did escape, Konev, Yeryomenko, Budyani, did so by abandoning their armies and fleeing east, leaving subordinate commanders to manage the chaos. Desperate breakout attempts by isolated units continued through mid-October. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes entire regiments, attempted to fight their way east toward Moscow. Most failed against German containment forces. Those who succeeded in breaking through often did so as scattered individuals, not as organized military units. By October 13th, German forces declared the Vyazma pocket destroyed. By October 20th, organized resistance in both pockets had collapsed. But as Soviet soldiers emerged from the pockets with hands raised in surrender, they were about to discover that capture was not salvation. It was the beginning of systematic extermination. The fate of the 514,000 to 600,000 prisoners taken at Vyazma-Bryansk was determined not by battlefield conditions, but by orders written in Berlin. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was not a logistical failure. It was not the unfortunate result of supply shortages or the chaos of rapid advance. It was the deliberate implementation of Nazi racial doctrine, specifically the Hunger Plan and General Plan Ost. These policies, developed before Operation Barbarossa even began, classified Soviet soldiers and civilians as Untermenschen, subhumans, whose lives had no value to the German war effort. The explicit goal was mass death through starvation. German planners anticipated and intended the deaths of millions of Soviet prisoners and civilians to free up food supplies for Germany and the Wehrmacht. Explicit orders from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, denied Soviet prisoners of war food, shelter, and medical care. These were not suggestions or guidelines for difficult circumstances. They were direct commands implemented at every level of the military hierarchy. The Quartermaster General's office issued directives stating that Soviet POWs should not be fed from German supplies. Local commanders received orders that prisoners were to be left in open fields without shelter. Medical officers were instructed that treatment of Soviet wounded was unnecessary. The ideological framework was clear. Soviet prisoners were expendable resources to be eliminated, not human beings with rights under international law. A German regimental diary from the Vyazma Encirclement captures the policy with chilling brevity. No rations for Russians. Let them die. Orders from above. This single sentence, written by an ordinary German officer documenting daily operations, reveals how ideology translated into action at the field level. The orders came from above, from the OKW, from Army Group Headquarters, from the Quartermaster General. But they were implemented by regular Wehrmacht soldiers, not SS death squads. The starvation policy was not the work of ideological fanatics operating outside military channels. It was official Wehrmacht policy, executed by the regular army as part of normal operations. Nazi racial doctrine provided the intellectual justification for mass murder through neglect. Hitler and the Nazi leadership genuinely believed that Slavic peoples were racially inferior, incapable of building or maintaining civilization, and destined to serve as slave labor for German colonization of the East. Soviet soldiers, as representatives of Jewish Bolshevism, were considered especially dangerous and unworthy of basic human treatment. The Geneva Convention protections for prisoners of war were explicitly rejected for Soviet captives. Germany had not signed protocols extending Geneva protections to Soviet POWs, and Nazi leadership made clear they had no intention of honoring such protections regardless. The result was a deliberate policy of extermination through starvation, exposure, and neglect. Genocide by bureaucratic process. Orders would be implemented with chilling efficiency by ordinary German soldiers who documented their own participation in atrocity. The death marches from Vyazma and Bryansk left trails of corpses stretching for hundreds of kilometers, a geography of deliberate murder. The encirclements produced scenes of industrialized suffering that revealed the true nature of German policy toward Soviet prisoners. Masses of captured soldiers were herded into open fields without food, shelter, or medical care. Deliberate exposure became a method of killing. German guards prevented prisoners from building shelters or foraging for food. Men stood or sat in open fields for days, then weeks, as autumn cold and rain sapped their strength. The dead were not buried. Bodies accumulated in piles as guards watched and did nothing. This was not the result of logistical chaos or supply shortages. It was deliberate policy, implemented with full knowledge of the consequences. 40% of prisoners died on forced marches before even reaching permanent camps. The marches from Vyazma and Bryansk to rear area camps covered hundreds of kilometers. Prisoners, already weakened by combat and days without food, were driven east at a pace designed to kill. Those who fell behind were shot. Those who asked for water were beaten or shot. Those too weak to continue were left by the roadside to die. German accounts describe the marches with casual brutality, referring to the shooting of stragglers as routine. The roads became lined with corpses. Local civilians who witnessed the marches described endless columns of skeletal men, barely able to walk, prodded forward by guards who showed no mercy. Soviet survivor testimony captures the horror in human terms. One survivor recalled, "We were left without food for days. Corpses lay everywhere, unburied. Guards laughed when we begged for water." Another described watching men die of thirst within sight of streams they were forbidden to approach. The testimonies reveal not just physical suffering, but deliberate cruelty. Guards who had food refused to share it. Guards who had water prevented prisoners from accessing it. The cruelty was not incidental. It was policy. The goal was death, and every action of the guards served that goal. German soldier accounts reveal the psychological framework that enabled mass murder. Letters home and diary entries describe Soviet prisoners using dehumanizing language borrowed directly from Nazi propaganda. Prisoners were vermin, reds, Asiatic hordes. The reduction of the pockets was described as pest control or a hunting season. One German officer wrote, "The enemy is caught like rats in a trap. We shoot them down like game. The corpses pile up everywhere." The language reveals how Nazi racial ideology functioned in practice. By transforming human beings into animals or vermin, it made their mass death not just acceptable, but necessary. The terms Untermenschen, shooting gallery, and hunting season pervaded German soldier accounts, documenting the psychological framework of dehumanization that enabled ordinary men to participate in atrocity. The killing continued long after the marches ended, as those who survived to reach the camps discovered that arrival meant only a slower death. The camps were not designed to hold prisoners. They were designed to kill them slowly while extracting whatever labor value remained. 80 to 90% of Vyazma-Bryansk prisoners died within months of capture. Of the 514,000 to 600,000 Soviet soldiers taken prisoner in the encirclements, only 10 to 20% survived to spring 1942. The primary causes were starvation, exposure, and disease, all the direct result of deliberate policy. The mortality rate was not an accident or an unfortunate consequence of wartime conditions. It was the intended outcome of the hunger plan, implemented with bureaucratic precision by the Wehrmacht and camp administrators. The camps were deliberately designed to maximize death through starvation. Rations provided to Soviet POWs were calculated to be insufficient for survival. Prisoners received a fraction of the calories needed to sustain life, even without labor. Those forced to work received no additional food. The result was predictable and intended: rapid physical deterioration. loss of body mass, organ failure, and death. The process took weeks or months, but the outcome was nearly universal. Survivors described camps where thousands of men slowly starved to death, too weak to stand, lying in their own waste, waiting to die. The camps provided no shelter, no sanitation, and no medical care. Prisoners were held in open fields surrounded by barbed wire. There were no barracks, no latrines, no hospitals. Men slept on bare ground through autumn rain and early winter snow. Typhus and dysentery spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions, killing thousands who might have survived starvation. German camp administrators made no effort to prevent disease or treat the sick. Medical care was explicitly forbidden by policy. Wounded prisoners received no treatment. Sick prisoners received no medicine. The camps became death factories, processing human beings into corpses through systematic neglect. Survivor accounts document guards preventing prisoners from foraging, laughing at suffering, and shooting those too weak to work. The cruelty was not the behavior of a few sadistic individuals. It was systemic, reflecting policy from the highest levels of command. Guards who showed mercy risked punishment. Guards who participated in cruelty were following orders. The system was designed to produce death, and it functioned exactly as intended. One survivor recalled, "The guards prevented us from eating grass or bark. They laughed when men collapsed. They shot anyone who tried to escape or who became too weak to stand." The testimony reveals the camps as sites of deliberate murder, where every aspect of administration served the goal of maximizing death. The fate of Vyazma-Bryansk prisoners was part of a systematic pattern across all 1941 encirclements. Less than 20% of all Soviet POWs taken in 1941 survived the war. The consistency of mortality rates, 80 to 90% dead across multiple encirclements, multiple camps, multiple regions, proves the systematic nature of the extermination policy. This was not local initiative or the result of particular commanders. It was centrally directed policy, implemented uniformly across the Eastern Front. The hunger plan was not a contingency plan or a response to supply shortages. It was deliberate genocide, executed by the Wehrmacht as official policy. While hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers died in camps and on marches, their German captors were celebrating what they believed was the war's decisive victory. In the flush of victory, German commanders made the fatal error of believing their own propaganda about Soviet collapse. Hitler declared, "The war is won," immediately after the encirclements were completed. The statement was not rhetorical flourish or propaganda for public consumption. Hitler genuinely believed that the destruction of the Western, Reserve, and Bryansk fronts meant the end of effective Soviet resistance. Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, described the Red Army as finished in his diary. Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, wrote that the Red Army was broken and would never rise again. Senior German commanders began planning victory parades in Moscow, scheduled for early November. The completeness of the operational victory convinced German leadership that their assumptions about Soviet weakness and German superiority were correct. German intelligence catastrophically dismissed evidence of Soviet reserve mobilization. Reports from the front indicated new Soviet formations appearing in defensive positions around Moscow. Aerial reconnaissance showed troop trains moving west from the Soviet interior. Interrogations of prisoners revealed plans for massive reinforcement of Moscow's defenses. German intelligence officers at Foreign Armies East evaluated this evidence and dismissed it. They concluded that the Soviets could not possibly raise significant new forces after the losses at Kiev, Vyazma, and Bryansk. They estimated Soviet reserve capacity at a fraction of its actual size. They assumed that the Red Army's ability to regenerate was limited by the same factors that would have limited a Western European army. The assumptions reflected the fundamental error of Nazi racial ideology. German planners believed that Slavic peoples were inherently inferior, incapable of the organization and motivation required for large-scale military mobilization. They assumed that Soviet losses, over 2 million casualties by October 1941, would break Soviet will to resist. They expected the Soviet Union to collapse, like France had collapsed in 1940, with military defeat leading rapidly to political surrender. The ideology blinded them to the reality of Soviet mobilization capacity, political resilience, and the willingness of the Soviet population to endure catastrophic losses rather than submit to Nazi occupation. The completeness of victory at Vyazma-Bryansk became its own trap. Success so total seemed to validate all assumptions about Soviet weakness and German superiority. If 3 entire Soviet army groups could be destroyed in 2 weeks, surely the Red Army was on the verge of total collapse. If 700,000 prisoners could be taken in a single operation, surely Soviet manpower reserves were exhausted. The logic seemed irrefutable. The problem was that every premise was wrong. The Soviet Union was raising over 1 million fresh troops, even as German commanders celebrated victory. The Red Army was reconstituting shattered formations, bringing forward reserves, and fortifying Moscow's defenses. The Soviet political system, far from collapsing, was mobilizing the population for total war. The fatal decision to press toward Moscow, despite exhaustion, deteriorating weather, and the approaching Rasputitsa, followed directly from this overconfidence. German forces were exhausted by continuous operations since June. Infantry divisions were at 50 to 65% of authorized strength. Panzer divisions had lost hundreds of tanks to combat and mechanical breakdown, with replacement rates far below losses. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometers over poor roads vulnerable to partisan attack. The autumn mud season was beginning, threatening to immobilize mechanized forces. All of these factors argued for halting, consolidating, and resuming operations in spring after rest and reinforcement. But the illusion of imminent Soviet collapse overrode operational reality. If the Red Army was truly broken, if Moscow was about to fall, if the war was nearly won, then pushing forward despite difficulties made sense. The decision to continue the advance toward Moscow in late October 1941 was the direct result of the overconfidence bred by victory at Vyazma-Bryansk. It would prove to be one of the most catastrophic strategic errors of the entire war. But even as German officers celebrated and planned victory parades in Moscow, the operational reality told a different story. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength, its ability to encircle and destroy entire armies, became the source of its ultimate failure. Reducing the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets required over 2 weeks of sustained combat. The encirclements were completed by October 7th, but organized Soviet resistance continued until October 20th. Those 2 weeks consumed crucial time during the narrow window before mud season and winter. Every day spent destroying trapped Soviet forces was a day not spent advancing toward Moscow. Every infantry division tied down containing the pockets was a division unavailable for the final push. Every artillery shell fired into the cauldrons was a shell not available for the assault on Moscow's defenses. The thoroughness of German operational doctrine, the insistence on completely destroying encircled forces rather than bypassing them, created a strategic cost that would prove fatal. German forces were exhausted by continuous operations since June. The invasion of the Soviet Union had begun on June 22nd. By early October, German units had been in continuous combat for over 3 months. Infantry divisions that began the campaign at full strength now fielded 50 to 65% of their authorized manpower. Casualties, disease, and exhaustion had worn down the army. Panzer divisions had suffered even more dramatic declines in combat power. Tank strength was reduced by combat losses and mechanical breakdown. The Wehrmacht entered Operation Typhoon with fewer operational tanks than it had in June, despite the addition of reinforcements. The human and material cost of victory from June to October left German forces ill-prepared for a final decisive battle. The thoroughness of encirclement diverted resources from the Moscow axis and delayed the final push. Completing the encirclements required using mobile forces, the Panzer groups, to close and maintain the perimeter while infantry divisions moved up to take over containment. This meant that the armored spearheads, the Wehrmacht's decisive weapon, were tied down for days performing static defensive missions. The delay allowed Soviet defenses at Moscow to strengthen. Each day that German panzers spent containing the Vyazma pocket was a day that Soviet engineers spent building fortifications around Moscow. Each day that German infantry spent reducing the Bryansk pocket was a day that Soviet reserves spent moving into defensive positions. The operational tempo that made encirclement possible became unsustainable as weather deteriorated and supply lines stretched. The rapid advances of early October, 50 kilometers per day, depended on good weather, functional roads, and short supply lines. By mid-October, all three conditions were deteriorating. The autumn rains began, turning unpaved roads into mud. Supply columns bogged down, creating shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food at the front. The distance from supply bases in Poland and occupied Soviet territory to the front lines around Moscow exceeded the practical capacity of German logistics. Trucks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Horses died of exhaustion. The operational system that had functioned brilliantly in the opening days of Typhoon was breaking down under the strain of distance, weather, and continuous operations. Each day spent reducing pockets allowed Soviet defenses at Moscow to strengthen with reserves, fortifications, and fresh divisions. The Soviet High Command used the time purchased by the encircled armies to rush reinforcements to Moscow. Over 1 million fresh troops were mobilized and moved to the Moscow axis in October and November. Over 1,000 tanks were transferred from other fronts and from newly mobilized reserve formations. Over 1,500 aircraft were concentrated for the defense of the capital. Fortification lines were constructed in depth west of Moscow. Anti-tank ditches were dug. Minefields were laid. The civilian population was mobilized to build defensive positions. By the time German forces completed the reduction of the pockets and resumed the advance toward Moscow in late October, they faced a fundamentally different situation than they had in early October. The paradox at the heart of German success was this: the very operational brilliance that achieved encirclement created conditions that made ultimate victory impossible by consuming time and resources in a race against weather and Soviet mobilization. The Wehrmacht's doctrine of encirclement and annihilation, which had worked so effectively in Poland and France, could not overcome the vast spaces, harsh climate, and mobilization capacity of the Soviet Union. Victory bred delay. Delay bred exhaustion. Exhaustion bred vulnerability. The supreme triumph of Vyazma-Bryansk contained within it the seeds of catastrophic defeat. As German forces finally turned toward Moscow in late October, exhausted and behind schedule, the weather itself was about to become their enemy. The same roads that had carried German panzers to their greatest victory now became impassable barriers of mud that consumed vehicles and men. The Rasputitsa, the mud season, began in mid to late October, transforming the operational situation overnight. The autumn rains turned unpaved roads into quagmires. Vehicles that had raced across dry ground in early October now struggled to move at all. Panzer divisions that had advanced 50 kilometers per day in the first week of Typhoon now struggled to advance 5 kilometers per day through knee-deep mud. Tanks bogged down and had to be towed free by other tanks, which then bogged down themselves. Half-tracks and trucks sank to their axles and could not be moved. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, trying to pull supply wagons through the mud. The mechanized warfare that had made German victory possible became impossible. Supply columns bogged down, creating fuel and ammunition shortages at the front precisely when the final push toward Moscow was beginning. The German logistics system depended on trucks moving supplies from railheads to forward units. The Rasputitsa made this impossible. Trucks that managed to reach the front consumed more fuel in the journey than they could carry. Ammunition expenditure rates exceeded delivery rates, forcing rationing at the front. Food supplies became irregular, leaving frontline troops hungry. The carefully calculated logistics that sustained rapid operations in good weather collapsed when roads became impassable. German units found themselves immobilized, not by enemy action, but by weather and geography. The time consumed reducing the Vyazma-Bryansk pockets meant the Wehrmacht hit the mud season while still over 100 kilometers from Moscow. If German forces had bypassed the pockets and pushed directly toward Moscow in early October, they might have reached the capital's outskirts before the Rasputitsa began. Instead, the 2 weeks spent destroying encircled Soviet forces meant that German spearheads were still distant from Moscow when the mud made further rapid advance impossible. The operational choice to thoroughly reduce the pockets rather than bypass them meant that the Wehrmacht's mobile warfare capability was neutralized by weather before it could achieve the strategic objective. Soviet forces used the weather-imposed pause to rush reserves to Moscow's defenses and construct fortification lines. The Rasputitsa affected Soviet forces as well, but they were defending prepared positions rather than trying to advance. They used the time to bring forward reserves, improve fortifications, lay minefields, and prepare defensive positions in depth. The weather that paralyzed German offensive operations bought the Soviets crucial time to strengthen defenses that were already formidable. By the time German forces resumed the advance in early November, after the mud froze but before adequate winter preparations could be made, they faced a defensive system far stronger than anything they had encountered in October. The operational paradox manifested in concrete terms. The delay caused by thorough encirclement meant German forces encountered the Rasputitsa before reaching Moscow, transforming operational advantage into strategic paralysis. The Wehrmacht's greatest victory became the cause of its inability to exploit that victory. The destruction of 3 Soviet army groups, achieved with brilliant operational execution, consumed just enough time to allow weather and Soviet mobilization to create conditions for German defeat. While German forces struggled through the mud, Soviet commanders were executing a mobilization effort that would shatter every German assumption about their enemy's capabilities. While German commanders celebrated the destruction of Soviet armies, those same armies were being rebuilt faster than the Wehrmacht could advance. The Soviet Union raised over 1 million fresh troops, while German intelligence dismissed evidence of reserve mobilization as impossible. The scale of Soviet mobilization in October and November 1941 exceeded anything German planners had considered possible. New rifle divisions were formed from reserve units, militia, and conscripts. Existing divisions were brought back to strength with replacements. Entire armies were created from scratch and rushed to Moscow's defense. The mobilization drew on the vast population of the Soviet interior, regions untouched by German advance. It drew on the political control of the Communist Party, which could compel mobilization and movement of population on a scale impossible in Western democracies. It drew on the willingness of the Soviet population to endure catastrophic losses rather than submit to Nazi occupation. Shattered front commands were reconstituted with new formations, commanders, and defensive positions at Moscow. The Western, Reserve, and Bryansk fronts that had been destroyed at Vyazma-Bryansk were rebuilt. New armies were created and assigned to these front commands. New commanders were appointed to replace those killed or captured. The reconstituted fronts took up defensive positions in the fortification lines west of Moscow. The speed of reconstitution shocked German intelligence, which had assumed that the destruction of front-level formations meant the permanent elimination of Soviet combat power in that sector. Instead, the Soviets demonstrated an ability to regenerate military formations faster than the Germans could destroy them. Commanders who escaped encirclement retained their commands and applied lessons learned to Moscow's defense. General Konev, whose western front had been largely destroyed at Vyazma, was given command of the Kalinin front north of Moscow. General Yeryomenko, whose Bryansk front had been encircled, was given command of other formations after recovering from wounds. Even Marshal Budyani, whose reserve front had ceased to exist, remained in high command. Soviet willingness to retain commanders who had presided over catastrophic defeats reflected a pragmatic recognition that experienced commanders were valuable even after failure. It also reflected the Soviet system's tolerance for casualties and defeats that would have ended military careers in other armies. Soviet mobilization system proved far more resilient than German racial ideology predicted. Nazi doctrine held that Slavic peoples were inferior, incapable of the organization required for modern warfare, and likely to collapse under pressure. The reality was exactly opposite. The Soviet system proved capable of absorbing catastrophic losses and regenerating combat power on a scale that German planners had not imagined possible. The Red Army lost over 2 million casualties in 1941, including the 700,000 lost at Vyazma-Bryansk, and continued to field effective military forces. The political system did not collapse, despite losing vast territories and populations. The industrial base, evacuated to the Urals and Siberia, continued producing weapons. The Soviet Union demonstrated a capacity for total war mobilization that exceeded that of Nazi Germany. The Red Army's ability to regenerate after catastrophic losses revealed the fundamental error in German strategic assumptions. German planning for Operation Barbarossa assumed that destroying the Red Army in the border regions would lead to Soviet political collapse and surrender. The assumption was based on the experience of France in 1940, where military defeat led rapidly to political capitulation. But the Soviet Union was not France. The Soviet political system was willing to accept losses that would have broken any Western European state. The Soviet population, facing a war of annihilation, fought with desperation unknown in earlier German campaigns. The vast spaces and population of the Soviet Union meant that even catastrophic losses in one region could be replaced by mobilization in other regions. German strategy was based on assumptions about Soviet weakness that were fundamentally wrong, and the consequences of that error would become clear in December 1941. The collision between German overconfidence and Soviet resilience would come in the forests and fields before Moscow, where the Wehrmacht's supreme victory would lead directly to its first catastrophic defeat. The road from Vyazma to Moscow was paved with German corpses. The victors of October became the defeated of December. German forces reached Moscow's outskirts in November, and December exhausted, under strength, and facing strengthened Soviet defenses. The advance resumed in early November after the mud froze. German units pushed forward against increasing resistance. By late November, advance units reached the suburbs of Moscow. They could see the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars. But the force that reached Moscow bore little resemblance to the force that had launched Operation Typhoon in October. Infantry divisions were shadows of their former strength. Panzer divisions had handfuls of operational tanks. Supply shortages meant inadequate ammunition, fuel, and food. Winter clothing had not arrived, leaving troops to face temperatures dropping below -30 degrees Celsius in summer uniforms. The exhaustion of continuous operations from June to December had worn the Wehrmacht down to a brittle edge. The overconfidence bred by Vyazma-Bryansk led to underestimation of Soviet defensive capabilities and reserve strength. German commanders expected Moscow to fall with one final push. They believed that Soviet forces were on the verge of collapse, that one more battle would break Soviet resistance. The intelligence failures that dismissed evidence of Soviet mobilization meant that German units attacking Moscow had no accurate picture of the forces opposing them. They expected to face demoralized remnants of beaten armies. Instead, they encountered over 1 million fresh troops in prepared defensive positions, supported by tanks and artillery in greater numbers than German intelligence had thought possible. Time and resources consumed reducing the pockets meant the Wehrmacht attacked Moscow too late, too weak, and in worsening weather. The 2-week delay caused by reducing the Vyazma-Bryansk encirclements proved fatal. Those 2 weeks allowed Soviet defenses to strengthen. Those 2 weeks brought the arrival of the Rasputitsa, which paralyzed German mobility. Those 2 weeks brought the approach of winter, which German. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.